So we're going to start with just an introduction about Peanut Farm, and then Brendan will cover some data that we have. A lot of our research is focused on roots and how irrigation changes the root architecture of the crop. We also look at some of the above ground processes as well, but we're going to concentrate today mainly on some of the large changes that we see in the root system. So in comparison to the other tools that are going to be talked about today, this is a low-tech option. So we're not here to say that Peanut Farm can schedule irrigation completely precisely, but this is a method that is based on a model. So we don't have a direct crop sensor, but it's based on a model, a checkbook method, very similar to the checkbook method designed at UGA. And in fact, Dr. Beasley worked with us a lot in developing this and testing this original model. And really, one of the benefits of Peanut Farm is just the platform that it is delivered on. So it allows a grower to go in and use it on a web, and now this past year on a smartphone. So it gives the convenience of the model-based decision in those formats. And so that's one of the benefits of Peanut Farm. So what is it? As I mentioned, it's both on a website platform, so you can use it in a desktop, a laptop, or a tablet, even in the field. And then this last year, we've collaborated between Alabama and Georgia and Florida to deliver it on a smartphone platform. Some of the things that we tried to build into the smartphone was to give it an automated GPS location where a grower could set up a field with this GPS location, and so have that automatically going into the system. And that would then link that field location to the closest weather station, which is what we use for the model data. The other thing that has a benefit to it, it has a yearly documentation feature, and we're going to go through that just a little bit, which allows you to keep track of the irrigation decisions that you've made historically. And that may be important as maybe regulations become a little bit more strict on water. You have a record keeping then of the irrigation decisions that you've made. Okay, so Brendan's going to go through the model calculations.
Hello. So this slide really just kind of outlines the inner workings of the model, and it's basically just a general checkbook method. And the way it works is there's an estimated total amount of available water that's calculated in the soil, and this is based on the rooting depth over the growing season, and then also the available water capacity of that soil texture. And then, so that's the total amount of water that can be available. And then the ETC of the crop is subtracted out of there, which is the reference ET multiplied by the crop coefficient that we developed. And the reference ET is one of the environmental parameters that's pulled from the weather station. And then it also adds in any rainfall and as well as irrigation, where the irrigation can be input by the user, and then the rainfall automatically updates based on the weather station that it's connected to. But there's also an option to go in and actually edit the amount of rainfall received for a particular site. And the trigger or threshold that it schedules irrigation on is when 50% of that total plant available water is depleted. And this is kind of a theoretical value that if you get below that, water is not as readily available, so you may start to see influences of water stress on crop development.
Okay, so basically what we're talking about, like for all checkbook methods, you've got the outputs that are leaving the system that are coming from evaporation and transpiration, so that's the ET value. You're taking the evaporation from the soil and the transpiration from the crop, but then you are modifying that according to the development of the crop and for the particular water use needs of that crop. And so that's where the crop coefficient comes in. We all know that peanut at 10 days is not going to use water the same way that it is at 70 days. So that crop coefficient basically associates that difference in water need of the crop. So the KC, there are some KCs out there that are developed by international agencies, but what we were trying to do was to develop one that related to our southeast conditions and for how the crop operates. We started with a model that was used by Anthony Drew, who's an extension specialist in Florida in Levy County, and Dr. Jerry Bennett on campus. He was my mentor in our department. And they had a system that they used several years ago where growers would call in and say, my crop is covering X% of ground. So they were just looking at the ground cover and saying, given that size of crop, then we can estimate how much water the crop is using. So that's a pretty close estimate of how to develop a KC. What we did in order to actually quantify that is we took data from Dr. Booty at UF, who has modeled peanut for many, many years and had a set of data over 10 years looking at leaf area index. So leaf area index is a more precise link to water use than ground cover is. It actually takes into account the canopy architecture of the crop, because we know that not only the leaves that are covering the surface, but leaves within the canopy are going to be losing water as well. So we took that LAI and then estimated thresholds for the crop water use and then calculated what those growing degree days would be. And so just by monitoring the temperatures and making a calculation of growing degree days for peanut, we were estimating then the crop water use. So the way we're getting at GDDs is a little bit differently. We went through and tested several different existing models for peanut and statistically found the best performing GDD model, and then added in the amount of water, knowing that that was going to impact the development of the crop. And so we term this the adjusted growing degree day. So it's a calculation of temperature and water. And over years of research, we've determined that the threshold, at least for maturity, is 2,500. So it's also a tool for maturity. But we also determined that at different aGDD, so different aGDD values would tell us what water use the crop was at. And so we could use that then for the irrigation scheduling portion of the model. So all is based on the calculation of these aGDDs. And Peanut Farm does that calculation automatically.
So next, I'm just going to run through a few slides that have some screenshots that just kind of show how you would go about kind of navigating and setting up an account in the online platform. So as Dr. Rowland said, it is on a website platform as well as a smartphone application. And to begin, it's pretty standard on most online things. You either sign up for an account or you can log into your existing account on the home screen. And then really all the information that's needed is just an email address, password, and name and phone number. And then you can also check a box to receive notifications if you're operating in a smartphone application that'll give you updates on the water status of a particular field. So as I mentioned in the model earlier, there's really four things that it needs to operate correctly, and that's the ET, the rainfall, any irrigation, as well as soil type. So the first step to set up an account is really on this Initialize tab. And here is where you have the option to enter multiple farms as well as fields within a particular farm. And then you can also add particular varieties that will then later be available in a drop-down menu. And also here, you can select a particular weather station that you may want that may be closest to a particular farm. So you can also, on the website, you can drop a pin that will, on a farm, and that will automatically load in the GPS coordinates and associate the closest weather station to that farm. Or if you're on your smartphone and you have your GPS location services enabled, it will also pick up your location through your GPS. And this is also the spot too where you can go in and pick a particular soil texture for whatever the site is that's used for determining the available water capacity. And then the next kind of setup phase you would go in and you would select the data for that particular season. And this is where you can go in and then you set your planting date, whether it's irrigated. You can change what weather station it's linked to, as well as select whatever cultivar you're growing. And really important here, this is where you have the option to go in and add irrigation, as well as edit any rainfall that's automatically been loaded into the weather station that may be recorded at a particular field. So that's basically the process of setting up an account and a farm and particular fields. And then after that is really just the irrigation recommendation tabs. And here, this is the just a status report, so you can load up all the different fields, and it just gives a brief overview of the field, how many days after planting you are, how many cumulative adjusted growing degree days that have occurred so far, and then the irrigation recommendation for that site. And the next is a history report, which is more of an in-depth day-to-day look at each particular field location. So this gives the daily, days after planting, irrigation recommendations for the whole season. And then this is where you can go in and look, about how many cumulative growing degree days you're accumulating in a day, and look at really the rainfall and irrigation that's been received for each day.
So as we mentioned before, the automated calculation of the aGDDs helps to make the irrigation scheduling decision, but it's also a great predictor of maturity. So this is also a tool that is delivered on Peanut Farm. And we have a new tool that, again, in conjunction with Auburn and with UGA, it is to actually upload images of scanned peanuts, and that will digitally analyze the color for you. So that's kind of the suite of tools available on Peanut Farm. So this model, of course, like every model, is not perfect, and so we've been testing this model over several years. When we first released it, we had a couple of years that I think weren't very robust at testing for dry conditions. We had fairly high rainfall patterns in Alabama and Georgia and Florida, and so this past year was really a test of it during dry conditions. So we're constantly going through and checking the efficacy of the model, adjusting the KC, seeing if we can improve it. But again, this is limited. This is based not on a field sensor, other than you're watching your rainfall, so it does certainly have limitations. But it's a tool, I think, that can certainly help improve irrigation scheduling decisions. So I think now what we want to do is go through some data that we've collected about the importance of managing your irrigation, what impact that can have, oftentimes below ground, that we're not seeing. And so Brendan's going to go through some data on some trials that he's been running.
So this is an irrigation study that we implemented in 2015 at the Plant Science Research and Education Center in North Central Florida. And this is just looking at soil-based irrigation scheduling that we used soil tension as our indicator of soil water content. So we implemented this in 2015, and we implemented 4 treatments. And basically what we did is we applied for every irrigation either 3/4 of an inch per application 0.45 inches per application. And then we had a treatment where we put 0.45 inches up until mid-bloom. And then any irrigation after that, we put 3/4 of an inch, and then we had a rain-fed control. And we used a threshold of 25 to 30 kilopascals on the aerometer because it's a deep sand site. So just some of the impacts that the irrigation had on overall whole plant development. What we noticed is on this graph, which is showing the leaf area index, so the amount of canopy area over the growing season, and on here I put 3 different arrows, and those indicate the 3 irrigation treatments we put on that season, which all occurred prior to 50 days after planting. So mid to late season was had adequate amount of rainfall, so we didn't put any irrigation treatments down. But what we noticed and observed was that those 3 irrigation treatments early on definitely affected canopy development later in the season, particularly at about 65 and 80 days after planting. The treatments where we put the higher 3/4 of an inch treatment on, we saw greater canopy growth in comparison to the 3 other irrigation treatments, which were all similar. So we also measured the impacts of root growth from these irrigation treatments, and we did this by augering a hole directly in the row, and we inserted clear PVC pipes, and this allowed us to go in with a camera and actually take pictures of the root system that was developing over the growing season. And then we can take these images like you see on the right and actually go in and trace the amount of root area, or the rooting, different parameters, root area, root volume, and total root length. And when we looked at the data, what we observed was both in the rain-fed and the 3/4 of an inch, we saw decreased root growth. Those two were similar comparing to each other, but they were decreased when you look at the 2.45 treatments. Now, all of the treatments were applied before that 50 days after planting, so our treatment where we applied 0.45 up until mid-bloom, and we're going to put 0.75 inches down with later irrigations, never really occurred. So these were essentially the same treatments, and they have a similar amount of total root volume when it's summed up over the whole length of that tube. So if you look at we definitely impacted root to shoot partitioning by these irrigation treatments, because what we observed is in the rain-fed treatment, where we had the greatest amount of water stress, we saw decreased root growth, and then also it was similar to the 0.45s and leaf area index. So overall, a reduction in growth. When we look at the 0.75 treatment, we had a lower amount of root volume, but this also had the greater amount of leaf area that developed. And then the 2.45 treatments, we had a less amount of canopy area, which was similar to the rain-fed, but we had a greater amount of root production. So if you look at the overall yield, then we were wanting to determine, well, is there a trade-off between in the reduced irrigation treatments between that root to shoot partitioning? If we have less canopy area, are we going to see a reduction in yield? And we did see just by those 3 irrigation treatments, a slight reduction in yield when we compare the rain-fed to the 0.75 treatment. It was about 750 pounds to the acre. But when you look at the 2 reduced irrigation treatments, there's a little reduction, but it's statistically similar to the full irrigation treatments. So really kind of the overall conclusions then were that the irrigation definitely affected the root to shoot partitioning, but we saw similar yields among the reduced irrigation and the full irrigation, but we also saw that increased root growth, which kind of leads us to ask the question then, if we would have seen more water stress later in the season, would the crop that had the reduced irrigation treatment early on be more resilient to water stress later in the season and possibly less yield reductions?
So consistently, our work is showing that when you reduce water early in development to some extent, I think most growers know this, you're setting up a better root system, but you're actually having long-term impacts then throughout the season. So the idea is balancing basically that stress level. And so again, these irrigation scheduling methods can help us to do that and help us improve the resiliency to drought of the crop. So I'm going to finish with just a couple of comments about a model that very similar in the way that we've developed it, and this is in combination with Wes Porter and Scott Tubbs, where we were developing an irrigation scheduling model for sesame. And so sesame has been considered a rotational crop for peanut. And so basically the idea is the same, trying to determine how to irrigate a new crop. And what we've done is developed a beta version, so a similar scheduling system to Peanut Farm for sesame itself, but only in a spreadsheet at this point. So if anybody's interested, we'd be happy to give more information on that. It is available on a disk, and so we can go through and provide that to you and run through it. So with that, we'd like to finish up, and of course, this work would not be possible without support both from federal agencies, but also the National Peanut Board, Florida peanut producers, and our colleagues for sure. So we'd be happy, I don't know if, Wes, do we have time for any questions?